Hello, and I'm Chris Blask, and the Vice President of Strategy with Cybeats. I'm on Sam Clemens in the Lower Florida Keys, somewhere around Upper Sugarloaf. With me today is Pablo Breuer, who has an amazing background serving the United States in the military for more than a quarter of a century, now in the private sector. Has created with Sarah Jane Terp, who's going to be on one of these with us before too long, the Disarm Foundation, Disinformation Analysis and Response Measures Organization. Pablo, good to see you. Thanks for joining. How are you doing?
Chris, thanks for having me. It's good to see you again. I'm well. Very exciting times. Not all of it good exciting, some of it bad exciting. I'm a little afraid to turn on the news these days, but we're getting by.
Well, on that note, so tell me a little bit about Disarm. Right, you and I have talked. We met over disinformation. I've been talking about this for some time. As everybody knows, this the company, the sponsoring us that I'm working with is a software supply chain security. You're a cybersecurity person like me, but I think this, the reason we're talking today is because I think these things are related, right? Our ability to control the clarity and certainty of information for supply chain, is a similar topic with disinformation and influence operations. So what is Disarm and what are you up to?
Yeah, so Disarm is a nonprofit organization that Sarah Jane Terp and I started with a couple other folks. And it is meant to take care of the intellectual property for an open source framework for countering disinformation. So what Disarm does is it lists out not only the kill chain to conduct disinformation attack, but the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we've seen. And then it also tells you how to counter each of those tactic, techniques, and procedures so that when you get together, under the big tent, the people from the various communities, you need to really solve this problem, whether it's technical or it's legal or it's psychological or it's industry, that you can all speak in the same language and collaborate effectively.
Right. You remind me, the first time I got on a call with Sarah Jane with SJ, and she showed me that the STIX taxonomy for disinformation that she was developing, you were developing with her, I think at the time, the AMIT framework, right? And the feeling I had, trying to convey to her at the time, having worked in threat intelligence and so forth, and looking at those sort of issues, the feeling I had seeing that someone had taken that level of rigor at that point in time with disinformation was heartening. So, right.
Yeah, no. So you're right. The first framework was called AMIT, the Adversarial Misinformation and Influence Tactics and Techniques. We started working on that in 2017. And then we've made sufficient progress on it, partnering with various other groups, that as we've gone to the next version, what we've done is we've relabeled it. We've given it a better name, which is Disarm. But it's still the same people. It's still the same effort. And we're still adding a lot of academic rigor. We've been fortunate to be able to partner and talk with a lot of institutions, from the Department of State to the European Union External Action Services, NATO, the Canadian government, and Alliance for Europe, just to name a few. And so it's really starting to catch on. A lot of people are starting to use and operationalize the framework and providing us feedback so that it can be made better for everyone else. And so the purpose of the Disarm Foundation, again, is to be that big tent where everybody can kind of come in and contribute to the open source effort so that it can make it a little bit better for everyone else.
Well, and that takes us right to our first question. So as we were discussing before this, what we do in these interviews is look back. You've been at this for a long time, in your area of specialty, look at where we are right now and try to look forward, right? So that first question, you had 25, 26 years in the military working in information warfare, and things changed during that time. This is literally the era that we all talk about, that everybody will talk about forever, when we went from you can call grandma to we're all on the internet together. And that's, from a cybersecurity perspective, a pet peeve of mine, that we in the technical world have said social engineering, it's just a thing. When that's like all of human conflict and interaction for centuries, and you worked in that space for a major public sector entity in the world during that transition. So how did things change, and how did we get to where we are today?
No, that's a great question. Actually, when I started very early on in briefing this, I had the opportunity to talk to the People-Centered Internet, which is another kind of fantastic nonprofit I've been involved with. And actually, Vint Cerf asked me the same question, and I answered it. And he still wanted to talk to me, so that's one of my marquee moments is telling the actual inventor of the internet that his baby was ugly, and having him still be willing to talk to me. So, let's talk about this. You're right. Disinformation and influence operations have been around since the age of man, right? Since we crawled out of the muck. And it used to be the case that if we wanted to do kind of disinformation, we would, have to take the message to the audience or bring the audience to the message, right? We'd write on cave walls, and they'd go and they'd read it. And then we, the first kind of major information revolution was the written word and parchment. And what happened during that age is that both the ability to transmit to an audience and the ability as an audience to receive are both severely limited. And why is that? Well, that's because literacy wasn't common, paper was expensive, or parchment was expensive, ink was expensive, right? And even if you get somebody to, write the message down on parchment, it had to be hand carried. And when it got to the distant end, you had to have a trusted party like, your local priest or deacon or the town crier read out the message to you. And that was okay. And then we start moving forward. We go to the, kind of first automated technology in the Gutenberg press. And now we've got movable type. And ink is still expensive and paper is still expensive, but now we can print more copies. And one of the second order effects of that is now the ability to receive it becomes more prominent. And the reason is not just because there are more copies that are hand carried, but now more people have the opportunity to learn to read. Now, this is also the first time where the creators of the technology, or the funders of the technology in this case, got bitten by the technology that they funded, right? So the Catholic Church was a big funder of the Gutenberg press. Everybody's heard of the Gutenberg Bible. They did not foresee that Martin Luther was going to mass print his 95 Theses and nail them to church walls. And so now what we have is an increase of reception, but again, who can transmit that message is still gatekept. You go forward, you've got telegraph and radio. Telegraph, there's a little bit of a reduction in the ability to receive. And the reason for that is that now you have to go to somebody that knows Morse code and actually owns the infrastructure. So you go to the local, American Telephone and Telegraph office, and they'll take your money, and they can either decide to transmit your message or not. They'll translate it in Morse code. At the distant end, somebody has to be there listening to receive it and then be able to transcribe it properly. But now most people can go to a local telephone and telegraph office, and as long as they're not, going to poke AT&T in the eye, they can do those things. Radio is the really next big change, because now you don't need any specialized knowledge to receive the information. You just go get this magic box and you tune it in, and you can receive the message. Now, the audience has grown. You can transmit at the speed of light. You've got high power transmitters, so you can go over a long distance and it's instant. But you can't just go down to your local radio station and go, hey, I'd like to talk to my town. So who can transmit is still limited. And the best example of this technology going awry is radio became kind of the de facto way that people received news. And some people tuned in a little late one day and thought that aliens were invading, because they turned to War of the Worlds, which was meant to be entertainment. And unfortunately, it was mistaken for a newscast. And so we go forward from that. Now we get to television, and it's kind of the same thing as radio. You just need a commodity device, but now instead of just sound or the written word, now you get pictures as well. And this one went awry when I believe it was NBC. It might have been CBS. Actually hosted an April Fool's Day news coverage of the spaghetti harvest in Italy. And they had this nice footage of these nice Italian women harvesting spaghetti from the spaghetti trees in Italy. And people believed it. Again, everybody could receive, but who could transmit? You better be the president of the United States, because you can't just go down to your local TV station and go, hey, I'd like to talk to the American public. And so now we fast forward to, the current times and the internet, and here's where we really kind of complete the cycle. So, the Gutenberg press, telegraph, radio, television were all about increasing the audience, but who could transmit to that audience was still gatekept. Social media allows anybody to mass transit. And it's really the first time that we've been allowed to do that, where anybody can transmit to a massive audience. And you've got somebody like Katy Perry that has 50 times the number of followers as the president of the United States, and 200 times the number of followers as the prime minister of Britain. And she can say anything to that audience without going through anyone. And then you add to that the fact that, if you were on a television station or radio, it was fairly easy to track down who actually said what. On the internet, it's not quite so easy, right? You've got sock puppets, and it's really kind of hard to track down the information that was broadcast to an originating source.
So, yeah, right. So here we are now, and for my part, in late 2007, I got involved with a U.S. political campaign, just a volunteer thing, and looking at the infrastructure available at the time. I'd been blogging a little bit, and writing a lot, before that. And part of distributing information for the marketing purposes of the companies that I've worked for over the decades leading up to that. And I found that, there was this, in that case, there was these infrastructure at the time. So, 4,000 teams across the U.S. and around the world, volunteers all got together, to discuss messaging and deliver it, to achieve an end, a political end. And since then, and that was a fairly spontaneous, organic thing, as for all I could tell, for my part of it. And that goal achieved, we all went back to our day jobs and so forth, but the mechanisms were there. And they weren't there before then. 2006, 5, 4, 2, late 1990s. There really wasn't the term social media wasn't used. They were all talking to each other, but not the same way, right? And the ability to spontaneously form, or for nation state purposes, intentionally, form that same sort of mass of communication. To either encourage, influence people, to discuss things in a certain way, or manufacture the discussion, is a lot of the world we're living in today. We have, the elephant in the room, Russia and Ukraine at the moment, where we have an information world that is different on either sides of that conflict. So where we are today, Anthony, if you can pop up the second question. All of this software supply chain security stuff is about information. Me saying, I made this software, here's what's in it to you, so you can use it for the purpose that you're using it for. Maybe you're running a nuclear power plant, maybe you're running an electric boat, who knows, right? But it has to be appropriate for that use. So we're putting in place all these mechanisms so that, individual organizations or individuals can attest to things to each other for more and more critical purposes about information, because software is just information. Am I wrong in seeing the parallel there, with, the influence and disinformation is delivered through these same tools, the same internet we all built, and we're delivering across this internet information about itself for purposes that are absolutely critical? Do they mesh? Are we building tools that will help with this, with disinformation and clarity and living in a shared reality?
Oh my goodness, yeah. So the short answer is no, and it's a lot worse than that. The longer the longer answer is, I want to go back to something you said earlier about government efforts to do influence, and then there was a little bit of a mention about selling things. And I will tell you that the difference between advertising and psychological operations is really, how am I trying to influence you? And I will tell you that the same tools that social media makes available to advertisers to give you that very targeted advertising are exactly what I need to do influence operations at the behest of a nation state. And the difference is that while in the 60s, 70s, and 80s you could do it, what it required is that you would go out and you do a sociological study, and you would get together focus groups, right? If you were of a certain age and you went to the mall in the 80s and early 90s, there were always these people with clipboards wanting to do a focus group and ask you what you thought of certain brands. Now you get it near real time, and you get it to a much finer resolution, which means that really you can launch these influence attacks and these misinformation attacks in a very targeted fashion in a very short amount of time. On top of that, the focus studies happen in real time because you get from these social media companies, what was the linger time? How long was the mouse over the thing? And so you can do a lot of A/B testing to kind of hone that message and make it more effective to your target audience a lot quicker. Going to the attestation bit, so there are three things that we need to be able to attest to. One thing, absolutely, we have to know where our software is coming from. And we have to know under what conditions our software is meant to operate and under which conditions it's meant to fail. I got myself in a lot of trouble going through school when I got into it with my computer science chair by saying, hey, computer science is not a science. It's an engineering discipline, and a bad one at that. And the reason I said it was a bad engineering principle without going down the whole epistemic thing is that, when you're an electrical engineer or a mechanical engineer or a structural engineer, you spend a lot of time learning how your designs fail and designing for them to fail in safe manners. And that is not something we teach computer scientists. That is not something we teach coders. And so when it fails ugly. It fails, blue screen of death ugly. In ways that we should have been able to predict and didn't, and put no guardrails in. So the first one is, having a trusted software source. And along with that goes the whole discussion of SBOM. Hey, the code I wrote is good, but it's reliant on, 150 libraries. If it's, the C standard library, I know where it comes from. I know it's been vetted. Some of these other things, not so much, which is why you end up with these really ugly vulnerabilities like Log4j and Apache struts and so forth, because, somebody that wrote an open source library no longer wants to maintain it or decides that they want to get back because they think for-profit companies are taking advantage. And they insert something bad, and you had no idea that your library was dependent, 3 or 4 scales down on another library. And so it's very, very hard to have that attestation. The next part that you need, particularly when it comes to big data and AI systems, is you need an attestation of where your data came from. A lot of times we're getting, these large amounts of training data that were collected, not necessarily maliciously, but by somebody else for other purposes. And we don't know which biases are there in the way it was collected or how the sampling methodology happened, so that we're not inadvertently inserting bad training data into our AIs and into our models. And then the last one, which we kind of alluded to, is who is transmitting that data, right? Is it somebody that, means well and is doing well? Is it somebody that means well and made a mistake? Or is it somebody that's trying to be malicious and influence us? So there's all sorts of attestation. Absolutely. Software supply chain is one of those. One of the things I like to point out, and I'm not the expert on this, I would direct you towards, the I Am the Cavalry folks or maybe Marie Moe. I know because I've done some reading on the kind of testing that goes into implantable medical devices as far as the hardware goes, right? Before they put a pacemaker in you, they do all sorts of hardware testing and make sure that that thing isn't going to fail. And if it fails in safe ways, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know anything about the qualifications of the person that wrote the code that makes that pacemaker run. Boy, that is not something that I just want to randomly apply a patch to, right? I do not want a patch Tuesday for a device that's supposed to be in my chest for 10 plus years. I also don't want kind of literally a sucking chest wound vulnerability in the software of that device. So we need to have those types of attestations. And it becomes worse when you're doing, remote weapon systems, remote censoring. These things literally affect the lives and well-beings of people, everything from self-driving cars to your smart IoT devices.
And this is the maturity level thing is, I'm always obsessing with, I love the critical infrastructure approach. I love boats, right? I'm on 2 electric boats that I built over the last year out on the water here that have to work and not drown and kill me. And there's weather and pirates and failures of things, right? Critical infrastructure always makes us look at that. And I always love working with the military because, a well-developed military view of things is even more so. It's like, well, we meant for things. No, no, no. Like we had to work it out, down to the most practical level that we can really move forward with, knowing things fail and everything else. And, this is the looking forward part, right? And I know I have an extremely optimistic view of this, but I worry about that because I might be missing something. And you're the kind of person who might help me with this, because I think as we move forward, this decade, the next couple of years, we're going to say, okay, for the big software, producers and the big software consumers, nuclear power, critical infrastructure, hospitals and so forth, we will do this, and we'll build up this structure where we can say, here's a piece of information that you can use for critical purposes and trust it, and, it's about the software inside your pacemaker or the inside the implants you're putting in other people's chests. And all that implies in an increasing threat environment where people are better and better at hacking these things and automated tools, so on and so forth. But as we think past just that stage, when every local grocery store, every gas pump everywhere, has to have or ends up having that same level of certainty, and the criticality may be lower, so the requirements are less, but the mechanisms get built in. I still tend to think that all of this, if we can make this information, certain enough, and I hate to use, all the ultimate words. I mean, certainty is great because how certain do you want to be? In the military, almost entirely certain would be great. There is no entirely, right? Half-ass is no good, but how close can we approach it? So, whichever way you want to take this, right, on the, just on our ability to keep critical infrastructures and less critical infrastructures working in an increasing environment, threat environment, where disinformation of the status of your infrastructure is really what's being hacked. Or in the broader term, are we getting into a more or less certain future, longer term?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting time for that, and just like a lot of things, this is really complicated. This is a multivariable calculus kind of a thing. It's not simple. So there's some good, there's some bad, and there's some ugly, right? So let me start out with the bad, and then we'll finish up on the good. So on the bad, you made some allusion to the military having a little bit higher quality stuff, right? Building things mil spec, and it's kind of funny because most veterans will tell you the last thing they want to buy now is mil spec. They want to buy right? But that's
defined at least.
But the reality is that the military has gone off of these mil spec things, and they're buying commercial off the shelf just like everybody else. Because frankly, Google and Amazon and Dell have resources that the U.S. government just doesn't, and it's just cheaper in the long run to do it that way. And so with that comes, some acceptance of risk. The other thing that's, it's bad is that, these software and hardware systems are becoming more complex, right? And so you can use whatever metric you want, but let's say a very proficient professional coder has, one bug per 1,000 lines of code, and every 5,000 lines of code, there's a critical vulnerability. Well, a modern car has 100 million lines of code, and these things are getting more and more lines of code. So just the way the math works out, you're going to have more vulnerabilities. And systems are going to be more reliant upon each other. Systems talk to systems without people in between now. And so the chances of, one of the multiple systems that are talking to each other having a bug that causes kind of this cascading casualty are higher. That's the bad. The good news is that we're talking about it, right? People are starting to ask the questions. And so, we're starting to have discussions about, what kind of laws and guardrails do we need in place? The National Highway Transportation Safety Administration is starting to test autopiloted cars, right? And these collision avoidance systems. So all of these things are good. Now, there's some other things that are going on that have nothing to do with technology that have me a little concerned. The whole Ukrainian crisis, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia thing is going on. And it's been fascinating to watch. I've watched multiple governments over the last 25, 30 years talk about, what would cyber reserves look like? What would, cyber letters of marque look like? What if we got, John and JQ Citizen to, patriotic hackers to come in on the side of the government? Well, we've got that now, right? And I'll be honest, it scares the hell out of me. And the reason is that there's a lack of command and control there. And the reason that's important is you talked about national critical infrastructure. And so it could happen. Right now, we've got these Russian patriotic hackers and these Western patriotic hackers, and it's kind of a free-for-all on the internet. What happens if one of those hits national critical infrastructure, hits a nuclear power plant in the United States or a kid's hospital in Russia, and now things escalate on the kinetic level? That's what's really keeping me up at night. The profession of arms is called a profession, and what we really don't want is amateurs throwing into the game. That's not going to be good. Unfortunately, the international law and Western law in particular are by design very rearward looking. We don't like to legislate things ahead of time. We wait till something bad happens, and then there's a court case, and then we go, gee, maybe we should have had a law for that. And this is one of those cases where I think we might want to lean forward a little bit and go, listen, we probably need some safeguards here. We probably need to have some licensing for professional coders. We probably need to have some international rules of the road for norms, and they don't have to be perfect, and they won't be. Whatever they are, some evildoer somewhere is going to toe the line. We're going to go, that's not what we intended. That's okay. We just moved the line. But perfection is the enemy of good enough, and right now we've got nothing.
Right, and the hackers for hire, the policy side of things, right? The lawyers and governance and standards. Listening to you, particularly at the end of there, right? I can see the ability to do this. We've seen the maturity change in our careers over the last 30 years. The ability of all sorts of stakeholders, like major public sector, individuals and actors and organizations, and the open source community has decades now of developing standards and agreeing and moving forward. I hope you're right. I think there's, I know you're right, but I hope we can pull those pieces together to avoid those sort of poisoning of the information well, right? And to just close on that, again, with your background, I have to think about disinformation. And with my background, what we're doing in supply chain security is just so aligned. We're talking about the information about the information, about the the information about all of this code we have, which is just really words, right? And if you touched on so many of these points, 5,000, how many lines of code does a car have? Well, how many will it have in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years? If it's always going to be more, and for the foreseeable and almost unforeseeable future it is, we end up at these forks. We'll either be able to secure that, or we can't have it, or things get dystopian. And I just don't think they do, right? So,
well, I think and again, I just want to highlight, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? I think we want to do, the art of the standard needs to be progressed a little bit, and I think what we need to do is also be realistic about the fact that the software is going to fail, the supply chain logistics are going to fail. Right? Bad people are going to do bad things. And we need to have a way for these systems, whether it's a logistical system or a software system or an industrial system, to fail gracefully. And what that really is just sound engineering. I mean, there's no magic there, but I'm going to show my age here a little bit, right? I remember when, software came out, and if you had to patch it twice in the lifetime of the software, you thought it was junk software, right? And it's because we didn't have the bandwidth. And now, I'm a gamer. I get my Xbox game or my PlayStation game, right? And on day one of release, there's a 40 gigabyte patch, right? Because it's good enough, ship it. In a game, it's not a big deal, right? In a self-driving car or in a weapon system or an industrial control system that controls water and sewage for a city, that's a big deal, right? And these industrial control systems they're going to be there 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We cannot afford for those things to be full of bugs.
Well, Sam Clemens here, has a leak in one of her 4 hulls, right? And the weather forecasts aren't really, accurate and so forth. However, I'm sitting here talking to you. I've got lots of power, and come hell or high water, I'll be at Sugarloaf, either today or on the weekend, because
you got a bilge pump, right?
Many of them, right? Yes. So
there you go.
Lots of pumps. Pablo, thank you very, very much for everything you've done for the country, for the world, for your time today, for being a good friend. It's great talking to you. Thank you, man.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Great to see you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.